Sometimes, the quietest act of kindness walks through the one door everyone else is too afraid to open. Grace Bennett had learned long ago that staying invisible was the safest way to survive. At 24, she moved through the sprawling Castellano estate like a shadow, her soft footsteps disappearing beneath polished marble floors and towering ceilings that echoed with silence more than conversation. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, always kept her eyes lowered, and never questioned the endless list of rules every employee memorized before their first day. Never enter the East Garden after sunset. Never touch anything inside the private garage. And above all, never go near the old stone kennel behind the greenhouse. Nobody explained why. They simply warned that it belonged to Mr. Vincent Castellano's dog, and everyone knew better than to ask another question. Grace had worked at the mansion for only 3 weeks, but she had already noticed something strange. Every afternoon, exactly at 4 o'clock, a faint, lonely whimper drifted across the gardens before disappearing into the wind. The other staff members pretended not to hear it. The gardeners kept trimming hedges without looking up. The cooks closed the kitchen windows. Even the security guards quietly changed the subject whenever the sound returned. It was as though the entire estate had agreed that ignoring sadness made it disappear. But Grace had never been very good at ignoring pain. On that unusually warm September afternoon, while carrying freshly folded towels toward the guest house, she heard the sound again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It was simply tired, the kind of cry that belonged to someone or something that had waited too long for comfort. She stopped walking. Her hands tightened around the stack of white towels as the breeze carried another quiet whine across the garden. Without realizing it, her feet began following the sound. Past the rose bushes. Past the marble fountain. Past the sign marked private. Every step reminded her she was breaking a rule, yet every heartbeat pushed her forward. Hidden behind ivy-covered stone walls stood a weathered wooden gate that looked forgotten by time. The latch wasn't locked. Grace hesitated for only a second before gently pushing it open. Inside, beneath the shade of a giant oak tree, lay an enormous white shepherd with silver around his muzzle. His thick coat, once brilliant, had become tangled with dirt and fallen leaves. A shallow water bowl sat untouched beside him, while dried mud clung to his legs from days of neglect. The dog's tired amber eyes slowly lifted toward Grace. She expected growling. She expected fear. Instead, the old dog simply watched her with quiet exhaustion, as though he had almost forgotten what kindness looked like. Grace slowly knelt several feet away and whispered, "Hi there, handsome." The dog's ears twitched. She reached into her apron pocket and found the small biscuit she had saved from lunch. Holding it in her open palm, she waited patiently without moving another inch. Nearly a full minute passed before the giant dog carefully stood, his stiff joints revealing his age more than his size. He walked toward her one cautious step at a time until his nose gently touched her fingers. Grace smiled for the first time all day. "You deserve better than this," she whispered as she softly brushed dried leaves from his fur. A garden hose rested nearby beside a wooden wash basin. She glanced toward the empty pathway leading back to the mansion, knowing exactly what every employee would say if they found her there. Then she looked back into the dog's weary eyes. Without another thought, Grace rolled up her sleeves, turned on the warm water, and began washing away weeks of dirt with slow, careful hands. Hidden behind the greenhouse windows, a tall man in a charcoal suit had been silently watching every second. Vincent Castellano did not move from the greenhouse window. He stood perfectly still with one hand resting against the polished wood frame, his expression unreadable as warm afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass. For years, every employee who had approached Max had done so with caution, obligation, or fear. Veterinarians came and went. Professional trainers made promises they could never keep. Even longtime staff members refused to enter the kennel unless they absolutely had to. Yet the young maid who had arrived less than a month ago had ignored every whispered warning without knowing she was doing anything extraordinary. She simply saw an old dog that needed care. Vincent watched as Grace worked patiently, never rushing, never forcing Max to do anything he did not want. She poured warm water into the basin a little at a time, testing the temperature with the back of her hand before letting it touch his fur. Whenever Max became uneasy, she paused and spoke so softly that Vincent could not hear the words, only the calm rhythm of her voice. The enormous shepherd answered with a slow wag of his tail, something Vincent had not witnessed in longer than he cared to remember. The sight stirred memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. 7 years earlier, Max had arrived as an energetic puppy with endless curiosity, following Vincent from room to room before growing into a loyal companion who seemed to understand silence better than most people understood conversation. Long business meetings, lonely holidays, sleepless nights, and endless responsibilities had all been shared with the patient dog lying beside him. Then age quietly changed everything. Max stopped running through the gardens. His appetite faded. His excitement disappeared. The mansion became quieter, and so did Vincent. Employees assumed the dog had simply grown old, but Vincent knew grief when he saw it. Animals mourned too. Since the passing of the only woman who had ever brought warmth into the estate, Max had never been quite the same. Neither had Vincent. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Samuel, the head of household operations, stepped carefully into the greenhouse. "Sir," he said respectfully, "should I ask Miss Bennet to leave the kennel?" Vincent kept watching the scene outside. Grace was drying Max with one of the towels she had carried across the garden, smiling as the old shepherd leaned against her shoulder with complete trust. "No," Vincent answered quietly. Samuel blinked in surprise. "Sir?" Vincent finally turned his eyes toward him. "Tell the kitchen to prepare fresh chicken and rice for Max tonight." Samuel nodded. "Right away, sir." He hesitated before asking, "Would you also like me to remind Miss Bennet about the rules?" Vincent looked back toward the garden once more. "She already knows something the rest of us forgot." Samuel frowned, uncertain of what his employer meant, but wisely chose not to ask another question. As evening settled over the estate, Grace carefully brushed the last traces of loose fur from Max's coat before refilling his water bowl with fresh, cool water. The old dog looked cleaner, lighter, and somehow younger beneath the fading sunlight. When Grace finally stood to leave, she smiled at him one last time. "You be good, Max. I will come see you tomorrow if they let me." Max gave a quiet bark, almost as if he understood every word. Grace closed the wooden gate behind her and began walking back toward the mansion, completely unaware that dozens of security cameras had quietly recorded every moment of her afternoon. Inside his private office, Vincent pressed a single button on the monitor beside his desk and replayed the footage from the beginning. Not because he suspected the shy young maid of doing something wrong, but because for the first time in years, he had witnessed something inside his home that money, authority, and influence had never been able to buy. Genuine kindness given with no expectation of being noticed. The next morning, Grace Bennet arrived before sunrise, just as she had every day since joining the Castellano estate. The mansion still rested beneath a blanket of pale blue dawn, its towering windows reflecting the first hints of golden light across perfectly trimmed gardens. She quietly tied on her apron, gathered her cleaning supplies, and reminded herself of the promise she had made before accepting the job. Work hard. Stay unnoticed. Never become a problem. She expected yesterday to bring consequences. Breaking a rule inside the estate rarely went unanswered. Every sound of approaching footsteps made her heart beat a little faster. Every time the house radio crackled, she wondered if someone would call her name and escort her to the front office with a polite notice that her employment had ended. Yet hour after hour, nothing happened. No warnings arrived. No supervisor questioned her. Even the other maids seemed unusually quiet, exchanging puzzled glances whenever Grace walked through the corridors. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Samuel appeared outside the grand library where Grace was dusting antique bookshelves. His expression remained calm, but there was an unfamiliar seriousness in his eyes. "Miss Bennet," he said politely. Grace immediately lowered the feather duster. "Yes, sir. Mr. Castellano would like to see you." The words drained the color from her face. For a brief moment, she could not breathe. Every frightening rumor she had overheard from the staff echoed through her thoughts. Some claimed the owner dismissed employees without explanation. Others insisted he rarely remembered the names of those who worked under his roof. Grace quietly nodded. Right now, Samuel offered a reassuring smile that barely softened the tension. Right now. Together they walked through hallways lined with priceless paintings and polished walnut panels until they reached the heavy double doors leading to Vincent Castellano's private study. Samuel gently knocked once before opening the door. The room carried the rich scent of cedar wood and freshly brewed coffee. Morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching across an enormous mahogany desk where Vincent sat reading several documents. He did not immediately look up. Grace stood silently a few feet away with her hands folded in front of her apron, careful not to disturb the silence. Nearly half a minute passed before Vincent finally closed the folder and lifted his eyes toward her. They were calm, thoughtful, and far less intimidating than the stories had suggested, although they still carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Miss Bennet," he said evenly. "Did anyone ask you to care for Max yesterday?" Grace swallowed nervously. "No, sir." "Did anyone give you permission?" She lowered her eyes. "No, sir." Another long silence settled across the room. Grace prepared herself to apologize, already rehearsing the words in her mind. Before she could speak, Vincent asked another question that caught her completely off guard. "Why did you do it?" Grace looked up for the first time. There was no anger in his voice, only genuine curiosity. She searched for an answer that sounded intelligent but found only the truth. "Because he looked lonely," she whispered. Vincent studied her without saying a word. "I know what it feels like when no one comes back," she continued softly. "Animals cannot ask for help the way people can. Sometimes they only need someone willing to notice." Vincent remained perfectly still, but something almost invisible shifted behind his steady expression. It was not surprise. It was recognition. For reasons he could not yet explain, the shy young maid standing before him had spoken words that reached far beyond the old shepherd waiting quietly in the garden. Vincent did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens where morning light shimmered across the fountain and ancient oak trees. Grace remained where she was, uncertain whether she had said too much. She quietly regretted speaking from the heart. Experience had taught her that honesty was not always welcomed, especially inside places built on discipline and distance. After several long moments, Vincent finally broke the silence. "Come with me." His voice was calm, neither cold nor warm, simply certain. Grace followed him through a private hallway she had never seen before. The polished floors gave way to a quieter wing of the estate where family photographs rested inside elegant walnut frames instead of expensive artwork. She noticed something unusual. In nearly every picture, a younger Max stood beside Vincent. Sometimes the dog was a playful puppy covered in mud. Sometimes he sat proudly during family holidays. In every photograph, his eyes were fixed on Vincent with complete devotion. Grace slowed her steps without realizing it. She had cleaned dozens of rooms throughout the mansion, yet she had never seen this hallway. It felt less like the home of a powerful businessman and more like the memories of a man who had carefully locked away every piece of happiness he had once possessed. Vincent stopped before another framed photograph. A woman stood beside him, smiling beneath autumn leaves while Max rested happily at their feet. Grace lowered her eyes respectfully without asking questions. She loved brushing his fur every Sunday afternoon, Vincent said quietly. She insisted that no matter how busy life became, Max deserved to feel cared for. Grace remained silent. There was nothing she could say that would improve such a memory. Vincent continued walking until they reached a glass door leading back into the gardens. Max was already waiting outside, lying peacefully beneath the same oak tree where Grace had found him the day before. The old shepherd slowly lifted his head the moment he saw her. His tail brushed against the grass before he carefully stood and walked toward her with far more energy than before. Grace instinctively knelt to greet him, smiling as Max gently rested his head against her shoulder. Vincent observed the quiet reunion without interrupting. It was a simple moment, but one he had not witnessed in years. There was no command, no reward, and no expectation. Only trust. He has refused almost everyone for a very long time, Vincent said. Even people who have cared for him since he was young. Grace softly scratched behind Max's ears. Sometimes they only need someone who does not expect anything from them, she answered. Vincent looked at her thoughtfully. Do you always understand animals this well? Grace smiled shyly. Not really. I just try to listen before I act. Those words lingered between them. Vincent realized that every expert he had hired had arrived with techniques, schedules, and expensive solutions. Grace had arrived with patience. Before returning to the mansion, Vincent looked toward Samuel, who had quietly appeared several yards away. Beginning today, Vincent said without taking his eyes off Grace, Miss Bennet will spend 1 hour every afternoon with Max. Her regular duties will be adjusted accordingly. Samuel nodded immediately. Grace looked up in surprise. Sir, I do not want special treatment. Vincent gave the faintest hint of a smile, almost too subtle to notice. This is not special treatment, Miss Bennet. It is the first decision I have made in a long time that feels unquestionably right. As Grace gently walked beside Max through the gardens, neither of them noticed the many employees watching from distant windows, quietly wondering how the shy young maid had accomplished what nobody else inside the Castellano estate had been able to do. The following week settled into a rhythm that quietly transformed the entire estate. Every afternoon, after finishing her morning responsibilities, Grace walked to the old oak tree carrying a fresh towel, a soft brush, and whatever meal the kitchen had prepared for Max. She never hurried. She never treated the hour as another assignment on a schedule. She greeted the aging shepherd exactly the same way each day, smiling as though she had arrived to visit an old friend rather than complete a task. Little by little, changes became impossible to ignore. Max began finishing every meal placed before him. His coat regained its healthy shine beneath Grace's careful brushing. Instead of lying alone beside the kennel, he wandered through the gardens again, stopping to smell flowers or resting beneath patches of warm afternoon sunlight. Even the gardeners noticed that birds had started returning to the oak tree where Max now spent most of his afternoons peacefully watching Grace work among the flower beds after their visits. Inside the mansion, conversations quietly shifted. The cook smiled whenever Grace entered the kitchen to prepare Max's food. Housekeepers who once avoided the kennel now paused outside the windows simply to watch the old shepherd gently follow her across the lawn. No one could explain it. They only knew that something inside the estate felt lighter than it had in years. Vincent noticed every detail without announcing that he was paying attention. During business calls inside his study, his eyes often drifted toward the garden cameras displayed on one of the security monitors. More than once, he caught himself lowering the volume of important meetings simply to observe Grace sitting beneath the oak tree while reading aloud from an old novel she had borrowed from the mansion library. She never realized she had an audience. She believed she was reading only to Max, who rested peacefully beside her with his head across her feet, listening as though every page mattered. Vincent found himself replaying those recordings long after the workday ended. There was no mystery left to solve. Grace had not performed some remarkable technique. She had not followed professional advice or expensive training methods. She had simply offered consistency, patience, and genuine affection without asking for recognition. One quiet afternoon, Samuel entered the study carrying several folders that required Vincent's signature. Before placing them on the desk, he glanced toward the security screen where Grace was laughing softly after Max clumsily chased a falling leaf across the grass. Samuel smiled. I almost forgot he used to play like that. Vincent did not look away from the monitor. So did I. Samuel hesitated before speaking again. Sir, the staff has been wondering if Miss Bennet should receive additional compensation for the extra responsibilities. Vincent folded his hands thoughtfully. This has never been about responsibility. Samuel nodded, waiting. She has given something back to this house that everyone else believed was gone forever. Silence filled the room again. Vincent finally signed the documents before setting down his pen. Increase her salary beginning this month. Do not announce it publicly. And make sure she has whatever Max needs before she ever has to ask. Later that evening, Grace finished brushing Max beneath the fading orange sky. She gently kissed 2 fingers before touching the top of his head with a quiet smile. Sleep well, sweet boy. I will see you tomorrow. Max answered with a contented sigh before settling comfortably onto the grass. As Grace disappeared toward the mansion, Vincent remained standing alone on the second-floor balcony, watching until she vanished through the garden doors. For the first time in many years, the enormous estate no longer felt like an empty building filled with expensive things. It felt, if only for a few peaceful moments each day, like a place where warmth had quietly found its way home. Autumn arrived quietly, covering the Castellano estate with shades of amber and crimson that turned every afternoon walk into something almost peaceful. Grace no longer counted the days she had worked at the mansion because, for the first time in years, work no longer felt like something she simply endured. She still cleaned the guest rooms, polished antique furniture, and helped wherever she was needed, but the hours she spent with Max remained the brightest part of every day. She spoke to him about ordinary things that no one else would have found important. She described the changing colors of the maple trees, laughed about the squirrels stealing acorns from the garden, and sometimes shared stories about the little farmhouse where she had grown up. Max listened with the quiet patience that only loyal old dogs seemed to possess. His cloudy eyes followed every movement she made, and whenever she paused, he gently rested his head against her arm as though encouraging her to continue. One afternoon, while Grace carefully folded a warm blanket across Max's favorite spot beneath the oak tree, Vincent approached without the usual distance he maintained from everyone around him. Instead of standing several yards away, he stopped beside the bench where Grace often sat reading. "May I join you?" he asked. The question surprised Grace far more than his presence. She immediately stood. "Of course, sir." Vincent shook his head slightly. "Please sit. You do not need to stand every time I arrive." Grace hesitated before sitting again, leaving enough space between them to remain respectful. For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were rustling leaves and Max's slow breathing as he rested comfortably at their feet. Finally, Vincent broke the silence. "Samuel told me you send most of your paycheck home every month." Grace looked down at her hands. "My mother lives alone now. She always worked hard for me. It feels right that I do the same for her." Vincent nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you keep for yourself?" Grace smiled almost apologetically. "Enough to pay my bills. I do not really need much more than that." Vincent looked toward the distant gardens. Throughout his career, he had met executives who measured success by numbers, investors who spoke only of profit, and influential people who seemed to collect expensive possessions without ever appearing satisfied. Sitting beside him was someone who possessed almost nothing yet carried a quiet sense of peace that wealth had never purchased. "Do you ever wish your life had turned out differently?" he asked. Grace thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes I wish certain people had stayed longer. Sometimes I wish my mother had never become ill. But I have learned that wishing does not change today. Being kind might." Vincent slowly repeated her final words to himself. "Being kind might." They settled into another comfortable silence until Max unexpectedly stood, walked between them, and gently nudged Vincent's hand before placing his head across both of their knees at the same time. Grace laughed softly. "I think he wants both of us to stop thinking so much." Vincent looked down at the old shepherd and smiled with a warmth that had become almost unfamiliar to his own face. It was not a large smile, but it was genuine. Watching the simple scene from a nearby garden path, Samuel quietly turned away without disturbing them. Later that evening, while reviewing another stack of business reports inside his study, Vincent realized he had spent the entire day thinking less about contracts and schedules and more about a quiet conversation beneath an oak tree. For the first time in many years, the future of the estate no longer seemed to depend only on careful planning. Somehow, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, hope had quietly become part of the household again. Several days later, as the last leaves of October drifted across the gardens, Grace received a phone call during her afternoon break. She stepped onto the quiet service porch before answering, keeping her voice low so she would not disturb anyone inside the mansion. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet when she returned, the gentle smile that usually brightened her face had disappeared. She finished her duties without complaint, brushed Max with the same patient care, and even read another chapter from her favorite novel, Beneath the Oak Tree. To anyone else, nothing seemed different. But Vincent noticed the small details everyone else missed. She laughed a little less. Her eyes lingered on the horizon a little longer. Even Max occasionally looked up at her with quiet concern, as though sensing a sadness he could not understand. The following morning, Samuel knocked softly on the study door carrying the day's schedule. Before discussing meetings or appointments, he placed a single envelope on Vincent's desk. "Miss Bennet asked me to give you this personally, sir." Vincent looked at the handwritten envelope before opening it. Inside rested a neatly folded resignation letter. Grace explained that her mother's health had recently declined and that a neighbor who had been helping could no longer continue. She wanted to return home before winter arrived so she could care for her full time. Her final sentence was simple. "Thank you for showing kindness I never expected to find." Vincent quietly lowered the letter. The room felt strangely silent despite the ticking clock above the fireplace. "When did she plan to leave?" he asked. "At the end of the week, sir," Samuel answered. Vincent nodded without another word. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived beneath the oak tree carrying Max's favorite blanket. She smiled gently as the old shepherd walked toward her, happily accepting the treat she had hidden inside her apron pocket. "I have something difficult to tell you," she whispered while scratching behind his ears. "I might not be here much longer." Max tilted his head before pressing closer against her, resting his chin across her knee exactly as he always did whenever she seemed troubled. Grace smiled through moist eyes. "I am going to miss you too." She did not notice Vincent approaching from the stone pathway until his quiet voice interrupted the moment. "Miss Bennet." Grace quickly stood. "Sir." Vincent held the folded resignation letter in his hand. "Is this truly what you want?" Grace hesitated before answering honestly. "No, sir. But it is what my mother needs." Vincent looked toward Max, who remained beside Grace instead of walking over to greet him as usual. The old shepherd seemed unwilling to leave her side. "You believe leaving is your only choice." "She spent her entire life taking care of me," Grace answered softly. "Now it is my turn." Vincent remained silent for several moments. He understood responsibility. He understood loyalty. More than anything, he recognized the quiet determination in someone willing to place family before personal comfort. Finally, he looked directly at her. "What if there were another way?" Grace blinked in surprise. "Sir." Vincent folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket instead of returning it. "Do not make any final decisions today. Give me 24 hours. Grace searched his expression, but found only calm certainty. Before she could ask another question, Vincent gently placed one hand on Max's back. The old shepherd looked from one familiar face to the other before settling peacefully between them, almost as though he already believed neither of them should have to say goodbye. The next morning arrived with a quiet mist that settled gently across the gardens, softening the edges of the sprawling estate. Grace woke earlier than usual, her mind filled with unanswered questions. Vincent had asked for 24 hours, but she could not imagine what difference a single day could possibly make. Family responsibilities were not problems that money or influence could simply erase. After finishing her morning duties, she carried Max's breakfast into the garden as she always did. The old shepherd greeted her with cheerful energy, his tail sweeping through the damp grass before he happily accepted the bowl from her hands. Grace smiled, although the sadness behind her eyes had not disappeared. "You always know how to make difficult mornings feel a little easier," she whispered as she stroked the soft fur around his neck. Nearly an hour later, Samuel approached with his usual calm expression. "Miss Bennet, Mr. Castellano would like to see you in the west drawing room." Grace quietly followed him through a part of the mansion she rarely entered. The drawing room overlooked the lake, where gentle waves reflected the pale autumn sunlight. Vincent stood near the fireplace holding a folder, but instead of business documents, several photographs rested on the table beside him. As Grace entered, he motioned toward a chair. "Please sit." She obeyed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Vincent remained standing for a moment before speaking. "Yesterday, after our conversation, I asked Samuel to learn more about your mother's situation." Grace immediately looked concerned. "Sir, I hope I did not cause unnecessary trouble." Vincent shook his head. "You caused none." He opened the folder and carefully placed several pages before her. "Your mother requires regular assistance with daily activities, but not constant hospital care. The nearest rehabilitation center is less than 40 minutes from this estate." Grace looked at him with quiet confusion. Vincent continued. "I spoke with the director this morning. They have already agreed to accept her. Transportation can be arranged, and every expense will be covered." Grace stared silently at the papers, unable to speak. "There is also a small guest cottage on the northern side of the property," Vincent said. "It has remained empty for years. If your mother wishes, she may live there comfortably while receiving treatment nearby." Grace slowly lifted her eyes. "Sir, I could never accept something like that." Vincent smiled gently, the same restrained warmth that had appeared more often since Grace entered his life. "You are not accepting charity." He glanced toward the window where Max rested peacefully beneath the oak tree. "You reminded me that caring for someone should never feel like a burden. Allow me the opportunity to remember that lesson." Grace felt tears gathering despite her effort to remain composed. For so many years, she had carried every responsibility alone that the simple idea of someone offering help without expecting anything in return felt almost impossible to believe. Vincent quietly continued. "If you still wish to leave after your mother is settled, I will personally thank you for everything you have done here." He paused before adding softly, "But I hope you will choose to stay." Grace lowered her gaze for a long moment before whispering, "You have already done more for my family than I ever imagined anyone would." At that exact moment, Max appeared outside the window carrying Grace's favorite reading book gently between his teeth after somehow finding it beneath the garden bench. Vincent and Grace looked at each other before laughing together for the first time. The sound filled the quiet room with a warmth that neither of them had expected, while outside, the old shepherd proudly wagged his tail as though he understood that sometimes the greatest healing began with the smallest acts of kindness. Winter arrived gently, but the Castellano estate no longer felt cold. Within 2 weeks, Grace's mother had settled comfortably into the small cottage overlooking the northern gardens, where morning sunlight streamed through wide windows and birds gathered outside every day. The nearby rehabilitation center provided the care she needed, and every afternoon Grace visited after finishing her work with Max. Slowly, color returned to her mother's face, and laughter returned to conversations that had once been filled only with worry. Grace often wondered how a place that had first seemed so intimidating had quietly become the safest home she had ever known. Life inside the mansion changed just as quietly. Employees no longer whispered when Grace passed through the hallways. They greeted her with genuine smiles, not because of her position, but because they had witnessed the difference one person's kindness could make. The gardens felt alive again. Max greeted every morning with renewed enthusiasm, proudly carrying tennis balls that he expected everyone to throw, even though he rarely chased them very far before happily wandering back with his tail wagging. Visitors often remarked that the old shepherd looked years younger than before. Vincent always answered with the same simple response. He finally found someone who listened. One crisp Saturday morning, Vincent invited the entire household staff to gather beneath the oak tree where everything had quietly begun. Long wooden tables were decorated with warm bread, fresh fruit, homemade pastries, and steaming coffee. It was the first time many employees had ever shared breakfast together outdoors. As everyone settled into their seats, Vincent stood beside Max, who rested peacefully at Grace's feet. The estate became completely silent. Vincent looked around at the faces that had helped maintain his home for years before his eyes finally rested on Grace. There was a time when I believed loyalty could be purchased, respect could be demanded, and problems could always be solved with resources, he said calmly. I was wrong. No one spoke. Several months ago, someone walked through a gate that everyone else avoided. She did not see rules first. She saw loneliness. She did not ask what she would receive in return. She simply cared. Grace lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the attention. Vincent reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a document before handing it to her. Beginning today, Grace Bennett will no longer serve as a household maid. She has accepted a new role as Director of Animal Care and Garden Wellness for the Castellano estate. Every animal that ever finds its way here will receive the same patience, dignity, and compassion that brought Max back to life. Grace looked at the paper with trembling hands, unable to find words. The staff responded with warm applause that echoed through the gardens. Samuel smiled proudly while several housekeepers quietly wiped away tears. Max barked once, as if celebrating the announcement in his own way, before gently leaning against Grace's side. Vincent smiled at the old shepherd before looking back at Grace. I once believed this house belonged to me, he said softly. Now I understand that a house only becomes a home because of the people inside it. Grace looked across the gardens, toward the cottage where her mother now waved happily from the porch, then back at Max resting peacefully beneath the familiar oak tree. She realized that the greatest changes in life rarely arrived with grand speeches or dramatic moments. They began with simple choices made when nobody was watching. One quiet afternoon, one forgotten gate, one lonely old dog, and one gentle heart had changed an entire household forever. As the winter sun settled across the estate, warmth remained where it mattered most, and that day everyone present remembered what true dignity, compassion, and kindness looked like.